The decline of Western Roman authority was not marked by a single moment of collapse, but by a slow and uneven transformation that unfolded over generations. By the early 5th century, the structures that had once sustained Roman power in the West were already weakened. Imperial control still existed in name, yet its ability to govern effectively across vast territories had diminished. Administration grew fragile, military discipline eroded, and the cohesion that had defined Roman rule for centuries gradually faded. Economic strain played a central role in this process. Long-distance trade networks contracted, urban centers lost population, and the tax system struggled to support an increasingly costly state apparatus. Large estates replaced small landholders, while rural communities became more isolated and self-sufficient. As resources dwindled, the central government found it increasingly difficult to maintain roads, fortifications, and professional armies. The burden of defense shifted away from imperial institutions toward local elites and regional strongmen. At the same time, internal political instability weakened the empire from within. Power struggles at court, frequent changes of emperors, and rival claims to authority undermined continuity in leadership. Many emperors ruled only briefly, elevated and removed by military factions whose loyalty depended more on immediate reward than long-term stability. This constant state of uncertainty eroded confidence in imperial governance and reduced the effectiveness of coordinated response to external pressures. Those external pressures intensified during the late 4th and 5th centuries. Groups commonly labeled as barbarians moved increasingly into Roman territory. These migrations were not uniform invasions by unified peoples, but complex movements involving warriors, families, and allied groups seeking land, security, or opportunity. Goths, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, and others crossed imperial borders, sometimes violently, sometimes through negotiated settlement. Roman authorities often granted these groups federate status, allowing them to settle in exchange for military service. Over time, however, these arrangements strained the empire's capacity to control its own frontiers. The Roman army itself reflected these changes. Recruitment increasingly relied on non-Roman soldiers, many of whom maintained their own leaders and traditions. While this integration was not inherently destructive, it altered the character of Roman military power. Loyalty shifted from abstract imperial ideals toward personal bonds and regional interests. The distinction between Roman and non-Roman became less clear, especially as imperial authority weakened. The city of Rome, once the unquestioned center of the empire, symbolized this decline. In 410, it was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Though the city recovered partially, its symbolic invulnerability had been broken. Later invasions reinforced the sense that the old order could no longer guarantee security. Political power increasingly gravitated away from Rome toward regional centers such as Ravenna, Milan, and Constantinople. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire existed largely as a framework without effective substance. Real authority rested in the hands of military commanders, many of Germanic origin, who governed in the emperor's name. One such figure was Odoacer, a Germanic leader serving as a commander within the Roman military system. In 476, he deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, an act that carried immense symbolic weight. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title for himself. Instead, he ruled Italy as king, formally recognizing the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. This moment has long been identified as the end of the Western Roman Empire. Yet Roman institutions, laws, language, and Christian structures did not disappear. Cities continued to function. Latin remained the language of administration, and the Church provided continuity and organization. What ended was not Roman civilization itself, but centralized imperial rule in the West. Political unity dissolved into a patchwork of kingdoms that adapted Roman traditions to new realities. The transition was gradual and uneven, experienced differently across regions and social groups. For many inhabitants of the former empire, daily life changed slowly rather than abruptly. Old structures overlapped with new ones, and Roman heritage endured even as new political identities formed. The year 476 thus stands less as a sudden collapse than as a marker of profound transformation. It represents the closing of one long historical order and the quiet emergence of another, shaped by adaptation, continuity, and change, rather than simple decline. After the disappearance of centralized Roman rule in the West, Europe entered a period of profound reorganization. The political vacuum left behind did not result in chaos alone, but in the gradual formation of new structures that adapted older traditions to changing realities. Authority became more localized, power more personal, and society increasingly shaped by regional conditions rather than imperial coordination. What emerged was not a unified system, but a mosaic of communities learning to govern themselves in the absence of a distant center. In many regions, Roman administrative frameworks continued to exist in modified form. Former officials, landowners, and military leaders assumed responsibility for maintaining order and managing resources. Written law and taxation persisted in some areas, though often on a reduced scale. Elsewhere, governance relied more heavily on custom, oral agreements, and personal loyalty. This blending of Roman practices with local traditions laid the foundation for early medieval political life. Local kingship became a defining feature of this new world. Leadership was no longer justified by imperial appointment, but by military strength, lineage, and the ability to provide protection. Kings ruled over relatively small territories, often composed of diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds. Their authority depended less on bureaucratic institutions and more on personal relationships with warriors and regional elites. Success in warfare, the distribution of land, and the promise of stability were central to maintaining loyalty. Land emerged as the primary source of power. With long-distance trade diminished and coinage in short supply, wealth was increasingly measured in fields, livestock, and control over labor. Those who commanded land could offer protection and sustenance in return for service. This exchange formed the early roots of a system based on mutual obligation rather than centralized command. Social bonds grew increasingly hierarchical, structured around dependence and reciprocity rather than citizenship. The rural landscape became the heart of early medieval life. Large estates dominated the countryside, while towns continued to shrink or transform into fortified centers. Agricultural production focused on local needs, with surplus exchanged through regional networks rather than empire-wide markets. Daily life revolved around seasonal rhythms, communal labor, and the management of scarce resources. In this environment, stability was valued more than expansion, and continuity more than innovation. The Christian Church played a crucial role in shaping this emerging order. As imperial authority receded, bishops and clergy became important figures of continuity. They preserved literacy, maintained records, and offered moral authority that transcended regional boundaries. Churches and monasteries functioned as centers of learning, charity, and administration. For many communities, ecclesiastical leaders provided the closest equivalent to organized governance, reinforcing social cohesion during a time of political uncertainty. Cultural identity during this period was fluid. The distinction between Roman and non-Roman gradually softened as populations mixed and adapted to shared conditions. Languages evolved, blending Latin with local speech, while legal customs combined inherited traditions with new practices. Rather than a sharp cultural break, the early medieval world was defined by gradual transformation and integration. Violence remained a constant presence, but it was often limited in scale and shaped by personal conflicts rather than imperial campaigns. Raids, feuds, and territorial disputes reflected the fragmented nature of authority. In response, communities sought protection through alliances and submission to local powers. This environment encouraged the development of fortified settlements and the consolidation of land under those capable of defending it. By the end of the 6th century, Europe had taken on a distinctly different character from the Roman world that preceded it. Power was dispersed, society more localized, and political identity tied to personal bonds rather than universal institutions. Yet beneath these changes lay elements of continuity that connected the past to the present. The early medieval world was not an age of absence, but one of redefinition, shaped by adaptation to new circumstances and the gradual emergence of structures that would define European society for centuries to come. Across the lands that once formed the western half of the Roman Empire, new political realities took shape as authority settled into the hands of emerging kingdoms. These were not sudden creations, nor were they built entirely in opposition to the Roman past. Instead, they developed gradually, blending inherited imperial traditions with the customs and leadership structures of the peoples who now ruled these territories. The result was a landscape of kingdoms that differed in character, yet shared common patterns of adaptation and transformation. The Visigoths established one of the most influential of these realms. After years of movement and negotiation within Roman borders, they secured territory in southern Gaul and, later, in the Iberian Peninsula. From their capital at Toledo, Visigothic rulers governed a population that was largely Roman in language, law, and religion. Over time, they adopted Roman administrative practices and sought legitimacy through legal codification. Their conversion from Arian Christianity to Catholicism marked a significant step toward unifying rulers and subjects under a shared religious framework, strengthening internal cohesion. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom offered a different model of continuity. Under the leadership of Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogoths ruled while consciously preserving Roman institutions. Civil administration remained largely in the hands of Roman elites, while Gothic warriors formed the military backbone of the state. Theodoric presented himself not as a destroyer of Roman order, but as its protector, public works were maintained, laws enforced, and cultural life encouraged. Though tensions persisted beneath the surface, this arrangement demonstrated that cooperation between Roman traditions and new rulers was possible, even if fragile. Further north, the Franks emerged as a dominant force in Gaul. Unlike many other groups, they embraced Catholic Christianity early, a decision that proved politically decisive. This alignment with the established church granted Frankish rulers the support of bishops and local elites, facilitating the expansion of their authority. Under strong leadership, the Frankish realm grew through conquest and consolidation, gradually absorbing neighboring territories. Power rested on a combination of military success, land control, and religious legitimacy, forming a durable foundation for rule. In Britain, the withdrawal of Roman administration created conditions for a different kind of transformation. Anglo-Saxon groups settled across the island, forming a patchwork of kingdoms rather than a single unified state. These realms developed independently, shaped by local geography and shifting alliances. Roman urban life faded more thoroughly here than on the continent, replaced by rural communities and fortified settlements. Over time, new political identities emerged, expressed through evolving languages, customs, and legal traditions distinct from the Roman past. Despite their differences, these kingdoms shared structural similarities. Kingship was personal rather than institutional, relying on the loyalty of warriors and the distribution of land and reward. Councils of nobles and advisors played important roles in governance, reflecting the collective nature of authority. Law was increasingly written down, not only to preserve custom, but to assert control and order within diverse populations. These legal codes often combined Roman principles with traditional norms, creating hybrid systems suited to local needs. Religion acted as both a unifying and dividing force. Christian institutions offered continuity, literacy, and moral authority, while also serving as channels through which rulers sought legitimacy. Monasteries and bishoprics became centers of influence, linking distant regions through shared beliefs and practices. Conversion was often gradual, shaped by political calculation as much as spiritual conviction, yet it profoundly altered social structures and cultural expression. Economic life during this period remained largely regional. Long-distance trade existed, but played a limited role compared to the Roman era. Wealth was grounded in land ownership and agricultural production, reinforcing the power of those who controlled territory. Towns survived in reduced form, often serving as administrative or religious centers rather than hubs of commerce. By the 7th century, the political map of Western Europe bore little resemblance to its imperial predecessor. Authority was fragmented, identities localized, and power rooted in personal bonds rather than universal systems. Yet these kingdoms were not temporary interludes. They established patterns of rule, law, and culture that shaped the medieval world. From their foundations emerged the enduring structures of European society, formed through adaptation rather than rupture, and defined by the balance between inherited legacy and new beginnings. While political authority in the Western Mediterranean fragmented, the eastern half of the Roman world followed a different path. Centered on the city of Constantinople, this realm preserved imperial structures, administrative continuity, and a strong sense of Roman identity. Its inhabitants did not view themselves as part of a new civilization, but as the continuation of the Roman Empire itself. Over time, however, this continuity developed distinctive features that shaped what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople stood at the heart of this transformation. Strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, the city controlled key land and sea routes linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and beyond. Massive walls protected it from invasion, while its harbors facilitated trade and supply. The city's wealth, population, and defenses allowed imperial authority to endure even as western provinces were lost. From this secure base, emperors governed territories that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and parts of the Near East. Administrative organization remained a defining strength. A professional bureaucracy managed taxation, law, and military logistics with remarkable efficiency. Written records, legal codes, and standardized procedures ensured a level of continuity unmatched elsewhere in Europe at the time. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the dominant language of government, reflecting the cultural realities of the eastern provinces while preserving Roman legal and political concepts. Religion played an increasingly central role in imperial life. Christianity was deeply integrated into governance, with emperors presenting themselves as protectors of orthodoxy and guardians of the faith. Church councils, theological debates, and doctrinal disputes were closely tied to imperial authority. Religious unity was seen as essential to political stability, and differences in belief often carried serious consequences. The close relationship between throne and altar defined the empire's identity and shaped its internal dynamics. The reign of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century marked a high point in imperial ambition. Determined to restore Roman control over former Western territories, Justinian launched military campaigns that temporarily reclaimed parts of Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain. These efforts were costly and demanding, but they reflected a continued commitment to the idea of a unified Roman world. Alongside military action, Justinian pursued legal reform, commissioning a comprehensive codification of Roman law. This legal corpus preserved centuries of jurisprudence and later became one of the most influential legal foundations in European history. Justinian's era was also marked by monumental building projects. Churches, fortifications, and public works reshaped urban landscapes, most notably the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Its vast dome and luminous interior symbolized imperial power, religious devotion, and architectural innovation. Such constructions were intended not only as places of worship, but as visible expressions of order and permanence in a changing world. Despite these achievements, the empire faced persistent challenges. Recurrent warfare strained resources, while outbreaks of disease, including a devastating plague in the mid-6th century, reduced population and disrupted economic life. External pressures mounted as well, with rival powers contesting imperial borders. Yet the resilience of administrative systems allowed the state to adapt, reorganizing military defenses and redefining priorities when expansion proved unsustainable. Cultural life in the Eastern Empire reflected a synthesis of classical heritage and Christian thought. Education emphasized rhetoric, philosophy, and theology, preserving elements of ancient learning while reshaping them within a Christian framework. Art and symbolism evolved toward more abstract and spiritual forms, reinforcing a worldview that emphasized divine order and imperial authority. By the 7th century, the Eastern Roman state had developed a distinct character, shaped by continuity and adaptation. It remained Roman in law and identity, Christian in faith, and Greek in language and culture. While the Western Empire had dissolved into regional kingdoms, this Eastern realm endured as a centralized power. Its survival provided stability in the Eastern Mediterranean and preserved traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Through endurance rather than conquest, the Byzantine Empire emerged as a lasting pillar of the early medieval world. In the early 7th century, a profound transformation began in the Arabian Peninsula, a region long shaped by tribal structures, trade networks, and deeply rooted religious traditions. Arabia stood at the crossroads of great civilizations, bordered by the Byzantine Empire to the northwest and the Sasanian Empire to the northeast. Yet much of the peninsula remained politically fragmented, with authority dispersed among tribes bound by kinship, custom, and mutual obligation. Religious life reflected this diversity, combining polytheistic practices with Jewish and Christian communities scattered across the region. Within this environment emerged a new religious message that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of vast territories. In the city of Mecca, a major center of trade and pilgrimage, the Prophet Muhammad began to proclaim a belief in a single, all-powerful God. This message emphasized moral accountability, social justice, and submission to divine will. It challenged existing hierarchies and economic interests, particularly those connected to traditional religious practices. Initial resistance was strong, and the early community faced social and political pressure. A decisive turning point came with the migration from Mecca to Medina, an event that marked the formation of a new community bound not only by faith, but by shared legal and social norms. In Medina, religious belief became the foundation of political authority. Agreements were established to regulate relations between different groups, and leadership combined spiritual guidance with governance. This fusion of religion and political organization proved crucial to the movement's rapid consolidation. Following the death of Muhammad in 632, leadership passed to a series of successors known as caliphs. Under their rule, expansion accelerated beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Motivated by a combination of religious conviction, social cohesion, and opportunity, Muslim armies moved into neighboring regions. The timing of this expansion was significant. Both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had been weakened by prolonged conflict, internal divisions, and economic strain. Their border provinces were vulnerable, and local populations often viewed new rulers with a degree of pragmatism rather than outright resistance. Within a few decades, vast territories came under Islamic rule. Syria and Palestine were incorporated, followed by Egypt, a region of immense agricultural and strategic importance. From there, expansion continued across North Africa, where existing trade routes and urban centers facilitated control. By the early 8th century, Muslim forces crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, establishing a presence that would endure for centuries. This rapid spread was not solely the result of military conquest, but also of negotiated settlements and administrative continuity. Governance in these newly acquired lands demonstrated flexibility. Existing bureaucratic structures were often preserved, and local elites retained positions of influence. Non-Muslim communities were generally allowed to maintain their religious practices in exchange for taxation and political loyalty. This approach encouraged stability and reduced resistance, enabling the new rulers to focus on administration and consolidation rather than constant conflict. Arabic gradually became the language of governance and culture, serving as a unifying element across diverse regions. Religious institutions developed alongside political authority, providing legal frameworks and moral guidance. Over time, the Quran and emerging traditions shaped law, education, and social norms. Urban centers flourished as hubs of trade, scholarship, and administration, linking regions from the Atlantic to Central Asia. The expansion of Islam altered existing power balances. Long-established borders dissolved, and new connections formed between distant lands. Trade networks expanded, facilitating the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Mediterranean world, once dominated by Roman and Byzantine influence, now shared space with a rising Islamic civilization that bridged continents. By the end of the 7th century, Islam had become a defining force across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe. Its spread reshaped political authority, cultural identity, and religious life on a scale unmatched in earlier centuries. This transformation did not erase existing traditions, but layered new structures upon them, creating a dynamic and interconnected world. The foundations laid during this period would shape the development of societies across 3 continents, leaving a lasting imprint on the medieval world and beyond. During the 8th century, the political landscape of Western Europe underwent a significant transformation as power consolidated within the Frankish realm. From a collection of regional authorities and competing elites, a new imperial structure emerged that reshaped ideas of kingship, governance, and religious legitimacy. At the center of this development stood the Carolingian dynasty, whose rise marked a shift toward greater unity and ambition in the post-Roman world. The Carolingians did not appear suddenly as rulers. Their authority developed gradually through control of land, military leadership, and close cooperation with the church. Originally serving as leading officials within the Frankish kingdom, they exercised real power long before assuming royal titles. This arrangement reflected a broader pattern of the early medieval period, where effective authority often mattered more than formal status. Over time, military success and political stability strengthened their position, making dynastic change appear both practical and inevitable. Under Carolingian rule, the Frankish realm expanded significantly. Campaigns were directed against neighboring peoples and rival powers, extending influence across large parts of Western and Central Europe. Conquest was not only a means of territorial growth, but also a method of enforcing political order. Newly incorporated regions were tied into the Frankish system through land grants, loyalty oaths, and religious integration. Military obligation and landholding became closely linked, reinforcing hierarchical relationships that shaped medieval society. Charlemagne emerged as the most influential figure of this era. His reign represented both continuity with earlier Frankish traditions and a bold reimagining of imperial authority. Through sustained military campaigns, he extended control over vast territories, creating a realm that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Eastern Europe. These efforts were costly and often violent, yet they established a level of political unity unseen in the West since Roman times. Beyond warfare, Charlemagne sought to impose order through governance and reform. He relied on a network of officials who represented royal authority at the local level, ensuring that laws and directives were implemented across distant regions. Assemblies brought together nobles, clergy, and advisors to discuss policy, reinforcing a sense of shared responsibility within the ruling elite. Written decrees standardized expectations, contributing to greater administrative coherence. Religion was inseparable from Carolingian rule. The alliance between the Frankish rulers and the papacy provided mutual benefit. Kings gained spiritual legitimacy, while the church received protection and support. This partnership reached a symbolic peak when Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome at the end of the 8th century. The act signaled the revival of an imperial title in the West, linking Carolingian authority to the legacy of Rome and framing political power within a Christian vision of order. This imperial identity was not merely ceremonial. It shaped how authority was understood and exercised. The ruler was portrayed as a guardian of faith and justice, responsible for both worldly governance and moral leadership. This concept influenced later medieval ideas of kingship and empire, leaving a lasting imprint on European political thought. Cultural and intellectual life also experienced renewed attention during this period. Education was encouraged among clergy and administrators, improving literacy and the transmission of knowledge. Schools associated with royal courts and religious institutions became centers for learning, preserving classical texts and refining methods of instruction. These efforts supported effective administration while fostering a shared cultural framework across the realm. Despite its achievements, the Carolingian Empire rested on fragile foundations. Governance depended heavily on personal relationships and loyalty, making stability vulnerable to succession disputes and regional interests. Maintaining control over such an extensive territory required constant negotiation and adaptation. These tensions would become more pronounced in later generations, revealing the limits of centralized authority in a diverse landscape. Nevertheless, the Carolingian era marked a defining moment in medieval history. It reintroduced the idea of empire in Western Europe, strengthened ties between political power and religious authority, and promoted structures that influenced governance for centuries. Through ambition, reform, and symbolic continuity, this period shaped the framework within which medieval Europe would continue to develop, balancing inherited traditions with new forms of organization and identity. From the late 8th century onward, communities across Europe began to encounter a new and unsettling presence arriving from the northern seas. These encounters were remembered for their suddenness and intensity, yet they represented only one aspect of a far broader transformation. The Viking Age was not defined solely by violence, but by movement, exchange, and the gradual integration of northern societies into the wider medieval world. The Scandinavian regions from which these seafarers emerged were shaped by challenging environments. Limited arable land, a growing population, and established maritime skills encouraged outward expansion. Longships, carefully designed for both open sea and shallow rivers, enabled travel across vast distances. With these vessels, Norse groups reached coastal settlements, river valleys, and inland communities that had previously been beyond the reach of distant raiders. Early encounters often took the form of swift attacks on poorly defended locations. Monasteries and small towns were particularly vulnerable, as they combined limited protection with visible wealth. Such raids left deep impressions on contemporary observers, reinforcing an image of relentless aggression. Yet these actions were neither random nor purely destructive. They followed patterns shaped by opportunity, geography, and knowledge gained through repeated contact. As experience accumulated, activities diversified. Trade became increasingly significant, linking Scandinavia to networks that stretched across Europe and into Asia. Furs, amber, timber, and slaves moved south and east, while silver, textiles, and luxury goods flowed north. River systems such as the Volga, Dnieper, and Rhine became corridors of exchange, connecting distant regions through commerce. Markets and seasonal trading centers emerged, facilitating interaction between cultures. Settlement accompanied movement. In parts of the British Isles, northern France, and the North Atlantic, Scandinavian groups established permanent communities. These settlements reshaped local societies through intermarriage, shared governance, and cultural exchange. In some regions, new political entities formed that blended local traditions with Norse customs. Over time, these areas developed distinct identities, influenced by both their origins and their surroundings. The impact on European political structures was significant. Repeated incursions exposed the weaknesses of existing defenses and encouraged the construction of fortifications. Communities sought protection through alliances with local leaders capable of organizing resistance. This environment favored the consolidation of power among those who could provide security, reinforcing hierarchical relationships and altering regional balances. Cultural influence extended beyond politics and warfare. Language, law, and social practices absorbed northern elements, especially in regions of prolonged settlement. Place names, legal terms, and artistic motifs reflected this interaction, demonstrating how integration followed confrontation. Religious transformation also occurred, as contact with Christian societies gradually influenced belief systems. Conversion was often pragmatic, tied to political advantage and social integration. Yet, it reshaped spiritual life across Scandinavia. The northern expansion reached far beyond Western Europe. Voyages carried explorers across the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, where new communities adapted to harsh environments. Others traveled eastward, engaging with Slavic and Byzantine worlds. These journeys contributed to the flow of ideas, technologies, and traditions, linking distant regions in unexpected ways. Despite their reputation as raiders, Viking societies were deeply structured. Leadership depended on reputation, wealth distribution, and loyalty. Assemblies provided forums for decision-making and dispute resolution, reflecting collective values within hierarchical frameworks. Honor, kinship, and reciprocity governed social life, shaping interactions both within communities and with outsiders. By the 11th century, the nature of northern involvement in Europe had changed. Raids became less frequent as integration deepened and political structures stabilized. Scandinavian rulers adopted Christian kingship, aligning themselves with broader European norms. Former raiders became landholders, rulers, and participants in established systems of power. The Viking Age left enduring marks on Europe. It accelerated connections between regions, reshaped political authority, and contributed to cultural exchange across vast distances. Rather than a brief interruption, it represented a dynamic phase of movement and adaptation. Through trade, settlement, and interaction, the Viking world became inseparable from the medieval landscape it once seemed to threaten, leaving a legacy defined by transformation rather than isolation. During the 9th and 10th centuries, European society gradually reorganized itself around land, protection, and personal obligation. As large empires fragmented and centralized authority weakened, people sought security in more immediate and tangible forms. Political power became increasingly tied to the control of land, and social relationships were structured around mutual dependence. From these conditions emerged a system that shaped daily life, governance, and hierarchy across much of medieval Europe. Land was the central resource of this new order. With limited coinage and reduced long-distance trade, wealth could no longer be measured primarily in money. Instead, control over fields, forests, and villages determined status and influence. Those who held land possessed the means to feed others, support armed followers, and exercise authority within their territory. In return for protection and access to resources, individuals offered loyalty, labor, and service. This arrangement created layered relationships between lords and vassals. A lord granted land to a vassal, not as private property in the modern sense, but as a conditional holding. The vassal pledged loyalty and agreed to provide specific services, often military in nature. These agreements were personal, reinforced through ceremonies and oaths that emphasized honor and obligation. Authority flowed downward through these bonds, while protection and legitimacy moved upward. At the top of this hierarchy stood kings and powerful nobles, whose influence depended on their ability to distribute land and maintain allegiance. Their rule was less about issuing commands and more about managing relationships. Governance required negotiation, reward, and the careful balancing of interests. Written law existed, but personal ties and customary practices often carried greater weight in resolving disputes and maintaining order. Below the warrior elite lived the majority of the population, the peasants who worked the land. Many were bound to estates through various forms of dependency. These individuals cultivated fields, tended livestock, and maintained local infrastructure. In exchange, they received protection and the right to use land for their subsistence. Though conditions varied widely, freedom was limited, and obligations were inherited across generations. Life followed the rhythms of agriculture, shaped by seasons, weather, and communal labor. Manorial organization became a defining feature of rural life. Estates functioned as largely self-sufficient units, combining agricultural production with local governance. Lords oversaw justice, collected dues, and organized defense, while peasants provided labor and goods. This localized structure reduced reliance on distant authorities and reinforced the importance of immediate relationships. Social stability depended on predictability and tradition rather than innovation. The church was deeply woven into this system. Religious institutions owned extensive lands and participated in similar patterns of obligation. Clergy and monasteries acted as landlords, administrators, and moral authorities. They reinforced social norms by presenting hierarchy as part of a divinely ordered world. At the same time, they offered spiritual reassurance and practical support, anchoring communities amid uncertainty. Feudal relationships were not uniform across Europe. Regional differences reflected local conditions, historical developments, and cultural traditions. Some areas emphasized strong noble lineages, while others retained greater royal influence. Despite this diversity, common principles prevailed. Land as the basis of power, personal bonds as the glue of society, and mutual obligation as the foundation of order. Conflict remained an ever-present element. Disputes over land, loyalty, and inheritance frequently erupted into violence. Castles and fortified residences spread across the landscape, serving both as defensive structures and symbols of authority. These fortifications reinforced the separation between those who ruled and those who labored, shaping the visual and social contours of medieval life. By the end of the 10th century, this land-based system had become deeply embedded in European society. It structured relationships from the highest levels of power to the daily routines of rural communities. Though often rigid and unequal, it provided a framework of stability in a fragmented world. Feudalism did not emerge fully formed, but through gradual adaptation to persistent insecurity. Its patterns of hierarchy and obligation would continue to influence European life for centuries, defining the medieval experience through connection, dependence, and the enduring bond between land and power. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Christian Church had become one of the most powerful and enduring institutions in medieval Europe. Its influence reached far beyond matters of faith, shaping political authority, social order, and everyday life. In a world where secular power was fragmented and often unstable, the Church provided continuity, structure, and a shared framework of meaning that connected communities across vast distances. The Church's strength rested partly on its organizational reach. A network of dioceses, monasteries, and parishes extended into nearly every region of Europe. Bishops oversaw territories that often rivaled those of secular lords, exercising judicial, economic, and administrative authority. Their ability to read, write, and maintain records gave them a crucial advantage in governance. In many areas, bishops served as advisors to rulers or acted as intermediaries between local communities and higher powers. Land ownership further reinforced ecclesiastical influence. Over generations, the Church accumulated vast estates through donations, inheritances, and royal grants. These lands generated wealth and sustained large communities of clergy and monks. As major landholders, church institutions participated fully in the economic life of the feudal world, collecting rents, overseeing labor, and managing agricultural production. This material foundation supported spiritual activities while anchoring the church firmly within the social hierarchy. Monastic life represented a distinctive expression of religious devotion and discipline. Monasteries followed regulated routines centered on prayer, work, and communal living. These institutions were not isolated from society, but deeply embedded within it. They functioned as centers of learning, preserving texts and cultivating literacy at a time when education was limited. Monks copied manuscripts, recorded local events, and maintained libraries that safeguarded religious and classical knowledge. Beyond scholarship, monasteries provided practical services. They offered hospitality to travelers, cared for the poor and sick, and supported surrounding communities during times of hardship. Their relative stability made them anchors of local life, especially in rural areas. Through these roles, monastic communities reinforced the church's presence and moral authority among the population. The church also shaped social values and norms. Religious teachings framed concepts of justice, duty, and morality. Festivals, rituals, and the liturgical calendar structured time and reinforced collective identity. From birth to death, individuals encountered the church through sacraments and ceremonies that marked life's transitions. This pervasive presence fostered a sense of belonging while reinforcing accepted hierarchies and roles. Political power and religious authority were closely intertwined. Kings and nobles sought ecclesiastical support to legitimize their rule, often presenting themselves as chosen or blessed by God. In return, the church benefited from protection and patronage. This mutual dependence strengthened both institutions, though it also generated tension. Questions over appointments to church offices and the proper boundaries between spiritual and secular authority became increasingly significant during this period. Reform movements emerged in response to concerns about wealth, corruption, and worldly influence within the church. Calls for renewal emphasized spiritual discipline, moral integrity, and independence from secular control. Monastic reforms promoted stricter adherence to religious rules, while broader efforts sought to clarify the church's authority and mission. These movements reflected a growing awareness of the church's power and the responsibilities that accompanied it. The influence of the medieval church extended beyond Europe's borders. Through missionary activity and diplomatic contact, it connected distant regions and contributed to the spread of shared beliefs and practices. Latin served as a common language for worship, learning, and administration, facilitating communication across diverse cultures. This unity reinforced the church's role as a trans-regional institution in an otherwise divided world. By the 11th century, the church stood as a central pillar of medieval society. Its authority was spiritual, social, and political, shaping lives in visible and invisible ways. Though deeply involved in worldly affairs, it offered a vision of order and purpose that transcended local divisions. Through its institutions, teachings, and rituals, the church provided continuity in an era of change, leaving an imprint on European life that would endure long after the medieval world itself had passed. During the 10th and 11th centuries, ideas of rulership in Europe were reshaped by the revival of imperial authority and the evolving nature of kingship. Power was no longer defined solely by control of land or military strength, but increasingly by claims to sacred legitimacy. Rulers sought to present their authority as part of a divinely sanctioned order, linking earthly governance to spiritual purpose. This vision found its most ambitious expression in the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial ideal rested on the belief that political unity and moral order were inseparable. The emperor was not merely a king among kings, but a figure entrusted with maintaining justice, peace, and the protection of the Christian world. This role drew inspiration from the memory of ancient Rome, reinterpreted through Christian belief. The empire was imagined as a continuation of Roman authority, transformed to serve a religious mission rather than a pagan past. Kingship within this framework carried profound symbolic weight. coronation rituals emphasized the sacred nature of rule, often involving religious ceremonies that framed power as a gift from God. Anointed rulers were seen as chosen figures, responsible not only for governance, but for the moral welfare of their subjects. This perception elevated kings above ordinary nobles, while also binding them to expectations of righteous conduct and protection of the Church. The Holy Roman Empire itself was not a centralized state in the modern sense. It consisted of a complex network of territories governed by dukes, counts, bishops, and abbots, each holding varying degrees of autonomy. The emperor's authority depended on cooperation rather than command. Assemblies and councils provided forums for negotiation, reflecting the shared but fragile nature of power. Loyalty was personal, shaped by oaths and mutual obligation, rather than enforced through uniform administration. Church institutions played a crucial role in sustaining imperial rule. Bishops and abbots often served as key administrators, advisors, and representatives of royal authority. Their positions provided stability, as they did not pass lands to heirs and were theoretically bound by spiritual duty rather than dynastic ambition. This reliance on ecclesiastical leadership strengthened imperial control while deepening the entanglement between religious and secular power. Yet the sacred character of kingship also intensified conflict. Succession was rarely smooth, as rival claimants contested thrones through warfare, alliances, and appeals to legitimacy. Bloodline, election, and divine favor were all invoked to justify claims. These struggles reflected the absence of fixed rules for inheritance and the high stakes associated with rulership. Political instability was a recurring feature, as disputes over authority disrupted regions and reshaped alliances. The tension between imperial ambition and local autonomy remained constant. Powerful nobles guarded their privileges and resisted attempts at centralization. The emperor's influence varied greatly across regions, stronger where personal ties were secure, and weaker where local identities prevailed. This balance between unity and fragmentation defined much of medieval political life, limiting the reach of imperial ideals even as they inspired loyalty and aspiration. Symbolism played a vital role in sustaining authority. Titles, regalia, and ceremonial practices reinforced the image of kings and emperors as guardians of order. Public rituals communicated legitimacy to a largely illiterate population, transforming abstract ideas of power into visible expressions. Through these displays, rulers asserted continuity with the past and stability amid uncertainty. By the end of the 11th century, the concept of sacred kingship had become deeply embedded in European political culture. The Holy Roman Empire stood as a testament to the enduring appeal of imperial unity, even in a fragmented landscape. Though challenged by internal rivalries and competing authorities, the ideal of a divinely sanctioned ruler continued to shape expectations of leadership. Medieval kingship emerged as a blend of tradition, faith, and negotiation, reflecting a world in which power was both contested and sanctified, rooted in the belief that earthly rule mirrored a higher, cosmic order. At the end of the 11th century, Europe witnessed a movement that reshaped relations between religion, warfare, and political ambition. What began as a call issued by the papacy evolved into a vast mobilization of people from across social classes, bound together by faith, expectation, and uncertainty. The early crusading movement did not arise suddenly, but grew out of long-standing tensions, religious ideals, and shifting power structures within the medieval world. The Eastern Mediterranean had long held deep spiritual significance for Christians in Europe. Jerusalem, in particular, was regarded as a sacred center associated with pilgrimage, devotion, and redemption. For centuries, access to holy sites had generally remained possible, even under Muslim rule. Yet changing political conditions and reports of instability contributed to growing concern among Western Christians. These anxieties were reinforced by broader developments within Europe itself, where religious reform movements emphasized moral renewal and active expressions of faith. In this context, the papacy sought to assert its spiritual authority on a wider stage. The call for armed pilgrimage offered a means to unite Christian warriors under a shared religious purpose. Warfare, long a source of internal violence among European nobles, could be redirected toward an external objective framed as sacred duty. This transformation of conflict into religious service redefined the moral meaning of violence, presenting participation as both penance and honor. The response was unprecedented. Nobles, knights, and common people alike took up the cross, motivated by a complex mixture of belief, hope, and necessity. For some, the journey promised spiritual reward and forgiveness of sins. For others, it offered opportunity for land, status, or escape from hardship. These motivations overlapped and shifted, reflecting the diversity of medieval society. The movement drew strength from its ability to accommodate both idealism and pragmatism. As the crusading forces moved eastward, they encountered unfamiliar landscapes and cultures. Logistics posed constant challenges, and coordination among leaders was often fragile. Despite these difficulties, the movement advanced through a combination of determination and adaptability. Local alliances and shifting circumstances shaped progress as much as military strength. The journey itself became a defining experience, reinforcing a shared identity among participants. The capture of Jerusalem marked a dramatic culmination of this initial phase. The city's fall was interpreted by many contemporaries as a sign of divine favor, reinforcing the belief that the campaign had been sanctioned from above. New political entities emerged in the region, governed by leaders who sought to balance military defense with administration of diverse populations. These arrangements were fragile, reliant on continued support and cooperation from distant Europe. The immediate consequences of the crusading movement extended beyond territorial change. It altered perceptions of the relationship between faith and power, strengthening the role of the papacy as a leader capable of mobilizing entire societies. Religious identity became more closely linked to political action, shaping attitudes toward outsiders and reinforcing distinctions between communities. The movement also intensified contact between cultures, exposing participants to new ideas, technologies, and economic opportunities. At the same time, the Crusades introduced enduring tensions. Violence carried out in the name of faith left deep scars, influencing relations between religious groups for generations. Internal divisions within Christianity were sharpened as differing interpretations of authority and purpose emerged. The crusading ideal, once established, proved difficult to contain, influencing conflicts far beyond its original scope. By the close of the 11th century, the Crusades had become more than a single campaign. They represented a new model of collective action, rooted in belief, but shaped by worldly realities. The fusion of spiritual aspiration with political ambition created a powerful, lasting force within medieval Europe. This movement did not resolve the uncertainties of the age, but it provided a framework through which faith, power, and identity were expressed. The legacy of these early years would continue to shape the medieval world, leaving an imprint defined by devotion, conflict, and the enduring search for meaning in a changing landscape. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, everyday life across Europe underwent gradual but far-reaching change. This period, often described as the High Middle Ages, was marked less by sudden upheaval than by steady growth and increasing stability. Population expanded, agriculture became more productive, and social routines settled into patterns that shaped how people lived, worked, and understood their place in the world. Agriculture stood at the center of medieval life. Most people lived in rural communities and depended directly on the land for survival. Advances in farming techniques improved yields and reduced vulnerability to famine. Heavier plows allowed farmers to work dense soils, while the use of draft animals increased efficiency. Crop rotation systems spread gradually, helping preserve soil fertility and stabilize food supplies. These changes did not eliminate hardship, but they made life more predictable and supported population growth. Peasant life followed the rhythms of the seasons. Sowing, harvesting, and tending livestock structured the year, reinforced by communal labor and shared responsibility. Villages functioned as tightly knit units, where cooperation was essential. Fields were often worked collectively, and decisions about planting or grazing were guided by custom rather than individual choice. Daily routines were physically demanding, yet embedded within a social world shaped by tradition, obligation, and mutual reliance. Material conditions varied widely. Some peasants enjoyed relative security, holding land that could be passed to their children, while others lived under stricter dependency. Homes were simple, built from wood, clay, or stone, with limited space and basic furnishings. Diets relied heavily on grains, supplemented by vegetables, dairy, and occasional meat. Despite constraints, village life was not devoid of meaning or celebration. Religious festivals, communal gatherings, and seasonal rituals punctuated the year, providing moments of relief and shared identity. Alongside rural stability, towns and cities experienced renewed growth. Improved agricultural productivity created surpluses that supported non-farming populations. Trade expanded, linking regions through markets and fairs. Urban centers attracted artisans, merchants, and laborers seeking opportunity beyond the countryside. These towns developed distinctive social structures, with guilds organizing crafts and commerce, regulating quality, and providing mutual support. Urban life differed sharply from rural existence. Streets were crowded, workshops noisy, and daily interactions shaped by trade rather than agriculture. Markets served as focal points for economic and social exchange. While living conditions could be harsh, cities offered freedoms unavailable elsewhere. Legal privileges, personal mobility, and access to new ideas fostered a sense of autonomy. Urban communities cultivated identities rooted in civic pride and shared interests. Social roles during this period were clearly defined. Family formed the core of daily life, with work and domestic responsibilities closely intertwined. Childhood was brief, as young people contributed early to household labor. Gender roles were structured by custom and necessity, with women playing central roles in both rural and urban economies. Though opportunities were limited by social status, women participated actively in agriculture, craft production, and trade. Religion shaped daily routines across all levels of society. The church calendar organized time through feast days and fasts, influencing work patterns and social gatherings. Parishes provided a sense of belonging, while rituals marked life's major transitions. Belief was deeply woven into everyday experience, offering explanations for hardship and hope for stability in an uncertain world. Communication and education remained limited, yet oral tradition thrived. Stories, songs, and shared memory transmitted values and knowledge across generations. Written culture expanded slowly, particularly in towns and religious institutions, supporting administration and learning. These developments reinforced connections between communities while preserving local character. By the 13th century, the High Middle Ages had produced a society defined by balance rather than excess. Rural and urban worlds coexisted, agriculture sustained growth, and daily life followed patterns shaped by custom and gradual change. Though inequalities and challenges persisted, this period offered a sense of continuity and order. The rhythms of work, faith, and community formed the fabric of medieval existence, grounding people in a world that valued stability, shared responsibility, and the enduring connection between land and life. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe experienced a renewed expansion of trade that transformed its economic and social landscape. This revival did not emerge suddenly, but developed from gradual improvements in stability, agricultural productivity, and regional connectivity. As commerce increased, towns grew into influential centers of exchange, reshaping daily life and altering long-established patterns of authority. Trade routes formed the backbone of this transformation. Rivers, coastal passages, and overland paths linked distant regions, allowing goods to circulate across vast distances. Northern Europe became connected through maritime networks, while the Mediterranean facilitated exchange between Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. These routes carried more than commodities. They transmitted ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that enriched urban life and broadened horizons. Markets and fairs played a central role in organizing commerce. Seasonal gatherings attracted merchants from different regions, creating spaces where goods were exchanged and information shared. Such events required coordination, protection, and trust, encouraging cooperation between traders and local authorities. Over time, these gatherings contributed to the growth of permanent trading centers, which evolved into thriving cities. Urban populations expanded as people migrated in search of opportunity. Artisans, laborers, and merchants settled in towns where demand for goods and services was high. This concentration of skills and resources fostered specialization, with different trades developing distinct identities. Crafts such as weaving, metalwork, and leather production flourished, supplying both local needs and distant markets. Guilds emerged as key institutions within this urban economy. These associations organized artisans and merchants, regulating training, production standards, and prices. Membership offered protection and support, ensuring that skills were passed down through apprenticeships and maintained within established norms. Guilds also played social roles, providing assistance during hardship and reinforcing a sense of community among members. Urban governance reflected these economic changes. Town councils and assemblies developed to manage infrastructure, enforce regulations, and represent collective interests. While cities often remained under the authority of kings or nobles, many gained charters granting degrees of autonomy. These privileges allowed urban communities to govern themselves, collect taxes, and administer justice, fostering civic identity and political engagement. The physical appearance of cities changed as prosperity grew. Stone buildings, fortified walls, and public spaces replaced earlier, simpler structures. Churches, marketplaces, and guild halls became focal points of urban life, symbolizing wealth and organization. Streets bustled with activity, reflecting the constant movement of goods and people. Trade also reshaped social relationships. Wealth increasingly derived from commerce rather than land alone, challenging traditional hierarchies. Merchants and skilled artisans gained influence, forming a new urban elite. Though inequalities persisted, cities offered possibilities for social mobility that were rare in rural settings. Legal freedoms, economic independence, and access to networks created environments where individual initiative mattered. Cultural exchange intensified through trade. Contact with distant regions introduced new products, techniques, and tastes. Spices, textiles, and luxury goods altered consumption patterns, while exposure to different customs encouraged curiosity and adaptation. Urban centers became spaces of innovation, where knowledge from various sources blended and spread. Despite growth, challenges accompanied urban expansion. Overcrowding, sanitation issues, and periodic shortages posed risks to health and stability. Conflicts between guilds, merchants, and authorities reflected competing interests. Yet these tensions were managed through negotiation and regulation, reinforcing the role of institutions in maintaining order. By the end of the 13th century, trade and urban life had become defining features of medieval Europe. Cities stood as engines of economic activity and cultural interaction, linking regions and shaping new forms of community. Through commerce, guild organization, and civic governance, urban centers transformed the medieval world, creating spaces where exchange, cooperation, and ambition converged within a dynamic and evolving society. The 13th century marked a period in which many of the political, cultural, and intellectual developments of the Middle Ages reached a point of remarkable maturity. Across much of Europe, royal authority grew more stable. Institutions became more defined, and confidence in established structures increased. This was not an age without tension, but one characterized by consolidation and a belief that order could be maintained through law, learning, and governance. Kingship during this century assumed a more organized and enduring form. Rulers extended their influence by strengthening administrative systems and asserting authority over territories that had previously been governed through loose personal bonds. Written records, legal procedures, and taxation became increasingly important tools of rule. Monarchs relied on officials trained in law and administration, allowing governance to function beyond the immediate presence of the ruler. This development enhanced continuity and reduced dependence on individual relationships alone. Royal power was also reinforced through clearer legal frameworks. Courts and legal codes offered mechanisms for resolving disputes and enforcing authority. Justice, though unevenly applied, was presented as a royal responsibility, reinforcing the image of the king as guardian of order. These systems provided predictability, fostering loyalty and compliance among subjects. While noble privilege remained significant, centralized justice gradually limited arbitrary power and shaped expectations of rule. Parallel to political consolidation, intellectual life experienced notable expansion. Universities emerged as enduring institutions dedicated to learning and debate. These centers of education brought together students and teachers from across Europe, creating communities bound by shared methods and language. Latin served as the medium of instruction, enabling ideas to circulate widely. The university became a space where knowledge was not only preserved, but actively examined and refined. Scholastic thought defined the intellectual character of the period. Scholars sought to reconcile faith and reason, believing that truth could be approached through systematic inquiry. Classical texts, particularly those of ancient philosophers, were studied alongside religious writings. Logical analysis and structured argumentation became central tools, shaping how questions of theology, philosophy, and law were addressed. This approach encouraged disciplined thinking and fostered confidence in human intellect as a means of understanding the world. Universities also supported the growing needs of administration and governance. Trained jurists, clerics, and advisors provided expertise essential to expanding states and church institutions. Education thus became closely linked to power, reinforcing the authority of those who controlled knowledge. Academic degrees conferred status and opened pathways to influence, further integrating learning into social hierarchy. Cultural expression reflected this sense of order and aspiration. Architecture, literature, and art flourished under patronage from kings, nobles, and the church. Cathedrals rose as symbols of collective effort and spiritual confidence, while literature explored themes of morality, duty, and human experience. These works conveyed ideals that reinforced established values while offering space for reflection. Despite achievements, the 13th century was not free from strain. Expanding authority provoked resistance, and intellectual debate sometimes challenged traditional interpretations. The coexistence of centralized power and local autonomy required constant negotiation. Yet the prevailing mood favored stability and coherence, supported by institutions that had grown stronger over time. By the end of the century, medieval society had reached a moment of balance between tradition and innovation. Political authority was more structured, learning more organized, and intellectual life more confident. The 13th century stood as a high point in medieval development, where governance, education, and thought aligned to create a sense of order and purpose. This period left a lasting imprint, shaping expectations of power and knowledge that would influence Europe well beyond the medieval world. During the 13th century, events unfolding far beyond Europe reshaped the wider medieval world in profound and lasting ways. From the vast steppes of Central Asia emerged a force that would connect distant regions through conquest, communication, and exchange. The rise of the Mongol Empire altered political balances across Eurasia and created channels of contact between societies that had previously been separated by distance and limited interaction. The Mongol expansion began among nomadic communities accustomed to mobility, warfare, and survival in harsh environments. Leadership was grounded in loyalty, discipline, and shared purpose rather than inherited titles. Under a unified command, these groups developed highly effective military strategies. Speed, coordination, and adaptability allowed Mongol forces to defeat far larger and more established armies. Their campaigns unfolded rapidly, reshaping territories from East Asia to Eastern Europe within a few decades. As Mongol control spread, an empire of unprecedented scale took form. Its territories stretched across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains, encompassing diverse cultures and economies. Rather than imposing uniform traditions, Mongol rulers often adapted to local conditions. Existing administrative systems were preserved where effective, while tribute and loyalty ensured imperial authority. This pragmatic approach facilitated governance across vast distances. One of the most significant consequences of Mongol rule was the expansion of long-distance connections. Trade routes across Asia became safer and more reliable under centralized control. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers moved with greater ease, carrying goods and information across continents. Silk, spices, precious metals, and technologies flowed along these routes, linking Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia more closely than ever before. European awareness of Asia expanded through these contacts. Envoys and travelers returned with accounts of distant lands, unfamiliar customs, and powerful rulers. Such reports broadened geographical knowledge and challenged existing perceptions of the world. While these interactions were limited to small groups, they marked a shift toward a more interconnected medieval consciousness. The Mongol presence also influenced political dynamics within Europe's eastern regions. Campaigns reached into areas previously untouched by large-scale external invasion, disrupting established powers and reshaping local authority. Though direct rule was often temporary, the impact lingered through altered trade patterns and new political relationships. European rulers became increasingly aware of forces beyond their immediate borders. Cultural exchange accompanied economic interaction. Ideas, artistic motifs, and scientific knowledge traveled alongside merchants and emissaries. Techniques in warfare, medicine, and administration circulated across imperial networks. While these exchanges were uneven and often indirect, they contributed to gradual changes within participating societies. Despite facilitating connection, Mongol expansion was marked by violence and destruction. Cities resisted conquest at great cost, and populations suffered during campaigns. These realities shaped contemporary perceptions, blending fear with fascination. Yet within the empire's boundaries, relative stability allowed commerce and communication to flourish, illustrating the complex legacy of conquest and order. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had begun to fragment into regional powers. Internal divisions and local adaptations weakened centralized control. Even so, the networks established during its height endured, leaving pathways for continued exchange. The world that emerged was more aware of its own breadth, with connections extending across continents. The Mongol expansion represented a turning point in medieval history. It demonstrated the possibilities of large-scale integration while exposing the costs of empire. Through movement, trade, and contact, distant societies became part of a shared Eurasian experience. This period reshaped how regions related to one another, laying foundations for a more connected world that extended beyond familiar horizons and altered the course of global history. In the middle of the 14th century, a devastating catastrophe swept across Europe, altering the course of medieval society with unprecedented force. The Black Death, a widespread outbreak of plague, moved rapidly along established trade routes and reached nearly every corner of the continent. Its arrival brought fear, confusion, and profound disruption, reshaping daily life and long-standing social structures. The disease likely traveled through networks that had connected Europe to the wider world. Merchant ships carried goods and, unknowingly, infection from ports in the eastern Mediterranean to Italy. From there, the illness spread inland, following roads, rivers, and market routes. Communities that had benefited from expanded trade now faced its darker consequences, as mobility facilitated contagion rather than exchange. Symptoms appeared suddenly and progressed swiftly. Victims experienced fever, weakness, and painful swellings, often followed by rapid decline. Medical knowledge of the time offered little explanation or remedy. Physicians relied on theories inherited from classical sources, attributing illness to imbalances or corrupted air. These interpretations provided limited guidance, leaving populations to confront the disease with uncertainty and desperation. Mortality reached levels unseen in earlier centuries. In many regions, entire families disappeared within weeks, and villages were left partially abandoned. Urban centers suffered heavily due to population density, while rural areas were not spared. Estimates vary, but a significant portion of Europe's population perished within a few years. This loss disrupted labor systems, economic activity, and communal life on a massive scale. Social responses to the plague reflected deep anxiety. Some sought spiritual explanations, viewing the epidemic as divine punishment or a test of faith. Religious practices intensified with increased prayer, fasting, and public expressions of devotion. Others turned to fear and blame, targeting marginalized groups in the hope of finding meaning or control amid chaos. These reactions revealed the fragility of social cohesion under extreme stress. Daily routines were profoundly altered. Fields went unworked, workshops fell silent, and trade slowed as movement became associated with danger. Traditional obligations were interrupted, and familiar hierarchies weakened. Survivors found themselves in a changed world where scarcity of labor shifted relationships between landowners and workers. Wages rose in some areas, while attempts to enforce older norms often met resistance. The psychological impact of the plague was lasting. Confrontation with widespread death reshaped attitudes toward life, faith, and community. Art and literature began to reflect themes of mortality and transience, emphasizing the unpredictability of existence. While these expressions varied, they shared an awareness of vulnerability that marked the era. Institutions struggled to respond effectively. Authorities imposed measures aimed at containing the disease, including restrictions on movement and trade. Though often inconsistent and limited in effect, these efforts represented early attempts to manage public health. Over time, communities developed practical responses, such as isolation of the sick and regulation of burials, laying groundwork for future approaches. By the early 1350s, the intensity of the outbreak diminished, leaving behind a transformed society. Population loss altered settlement patterns, economic priorities, and social expectations. The balance of power between different groups shifted, opening possibilities for change alongside enduring trauma. Though recovery was gradual and uneven, the effects of the Black Death persisted for generations. The plague did not simply interrupt medieval life, it redefined it. In its aftermath, communities adapted to new realities shaped by absence and resilience. The Black Death stands as one of the most profound turning points of the Middle Ages, revealing both the fragility and adaptability of human societies when confronted with overwhelming crisis. The 14th century was marked by a series of overlapping challenges that unsettled the foundations of medieval society. Environmental hardship, social unrest, and political instability combined to create a prolonged period of strain, often described as a time of crisis. These difficulties did not arise from a single cause, but from the convergence of long-term pressures that exposed the limits of established structures. Food scarcity played a central role in this period of instability. Climatic changes brought colder, wetter conditions that reduced agricultural productivity. Harvest failures became more frequent, particularly in regions heavily dependent on grain cultivation. Poor yields led to rising prices and widespread hunger, affecting both rural communities and urban populations. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease and intensified existing vulnerabilities. Economic stress extended beyond agriculture. Trade networks disrupted by war and insecurity struggled to recover from earlier shocks. Crafts and commerce declined in many towns as demand fell and resources grew scarce. These economic pressures strained relationships between producers, merchants, and authorities, increasing dissatisfaction among different social groups. Social unrest emerged as a visible expression of this tension. Peasants and urban laborers, burdened by taxes and obligations, began to challenge traditional expectations. Uprisings broke out in various regions, driven by grievances over wages, rents, and legal restrictions. These movements reflected frustration with attempts to preserve older hierarchies despite changing conditions. Though often suppressed, they signaled shifting attitudes toward authority and social justice. Feudal relationships were particularly affected. The demographic losses of earlier decades had altered the balance between landowners and laborers. With fewer workers available, peasants gained leverage, while lords struggled to maintain control over estates. Efforts to enforce traditional obligations met resistance, highlighting the weakening of customary bonds. Personal loyalty, once reinforced by mutual dependence, became increasingly difficult to sustain. Political instability compounded these challenges. Conflicts between ruling dynasties and competing elites disrupted governance and drained resources. Warfare placed heavy demands on populations already under strain, exacerbating economic and social pressures. Authority appeared less capable of ensuring order, undermining confidence in established leadership. Cultural and religious responses reflected this uncertainty. Trust in institutions wavered as communities searched for explanations and reassurance. New forms of expression emerged, addressing themes of suffering, injustice, and moral responsibility. These responses revealed both disillusionment and a desire for renewal, suggesting that crisis also stimulated reflection and adaptation. Urban life was not immune to these pressures. Cities faced overcrowding, declining trade, and internal conflict. Guilds and councils struggled to balance competing interests while maintaining stability. Yet urban communities also demonstrated resilience, adapting regulations and practices to meet new realities. The ability to negotiate change became essential to survival. Despite the severity of these crises, they did not result in complete collapse. Instead, they accelerated transformation. Traditional structures were questioned, modified, or replaced as society adjusted to new conditions. Feudal arrangements lost some of their rigidity, opening space for alternative forms of organization and authority. By the end of the 14th century, the medieval world had been reshaped by hardship. Population levels remained lower, social relations more fluid, and expectations of authority altered. The crisis revealed vulnerabilities within long-standing systems, but also demonstrated human capacity for adaptation. Through famine, unrest, and upheaval, the foundations of medieval society shifted, setting the stage for further change and redefining the balance between continuity and transformation. In a world moving beyond its earlier certainties, from the mid-14th to the mid-15th century, Western Europe was shaped by a prolonged conflict that altered political authority, military practice, and collective identity. The struggle between England and France unfolded over generations, marked by intermittent fighting rather than continuous warfare. Its length and complexity reflected deeper tensions rooted in dynastic claims, feudal obligations, and the evolving nature of kingship. At its core, the conflict grew from competing ideas of legitimacy. English rulers claimed rights to the French crown through lineage, while French kings asserted sovereignty grounded in local custom and law. These overlapping claims transformed political rivalry into armed confrontation. Warfare became a means of asserting authority where diplomacy failed, drawing both kingdoms into repeated cycles of invasion, defense, and negotiation. The nature of warfare itself changed during this period. Traditional feudal levies proved insufficient for prolonged campaigns, encouraging the use of paid soldiers and standing forces. New weapons and tactics altered the balance between mounted knights and infantry. Long-range projectiles, disciplined formations, and strategic use of terrain challenged established military ideals. These developments reshaped the role of the warrior class and diminished the dominance of traditional cavalry. Civilian populations bore the heaviest burdens. Campaigns devastated rural areas, disrupting agriculture and trade. Villages were abandoned, fields left untended, and communities displaced. The uncertainty of warfare compounded existing hardships, intensifying social strain. Towns fortified their defenses, while local leaders sought protection through shifting alliances. Daily life adapted to persistent insecurity. Political authority evolved in response to these pressures. Rulers required greater resources to sustain military efforts, leading to expanded taxation and administrative oversight. This demand strengthened central institutions, while increasing tensions between monarchs and subjects. Governance became more structured, relying on officials trained in law and finance rather than personal loyalty alone. These changes laid foundations for more centralized states. National identity gradually emerged from shared experience. Loyalty increasingly aligned with territorial and linguistic boundaries rather than feudal ties. Chronicles, symbols, and collective memory reinforced distinctions between communities. The idea of belonging to a realm gained significance, shaping perceptions of duty and sacrifice. Warfare thus contributed not only to destruction, but to the formation of enduring identities. Leadership played a critical role in shaping outcomes. Periods of strong guidance restored morale and organization, while internal divisions weakened resolve. The fortunes of war shifted repeatedly, reflecting changes in strategy, resources, and cohesion. Victory was rarely decisive, reinforcing the drawn-out nature of the conflict. Economic consequences were profound. Sustained warfare drained treasuries and disrupted commerce, yet it also stimulated innovation in finance and administration. Systems for raising funds, managing debt, and supplying armies grew more sophisticated. These mechanisms strengthened state capacity and influenced future governance. Cultural expression reflected the realities of prolonged conflict. Literature and art grappled with themes of honor, suffering, and endurance. Heroic ideals adapted to new circumstances, blending traditional values with emerging notions of service to the realm. Memory of hardship and resilience shaped narratives passed down through generations. By the mid-15th century, the conflict gradually drew to a close. Exhaustion, shifting political priorities, and changing military realities reduced the appetite for continued warfare. The outcome reshaped territorial boundaries and affirmed the authority of established monarchies. More importantly, the war transformed how power, identity, and warfare were understood. The 100 Years' War left a legacy defined by endurance and adaptation. It accelerated the transition from feudal structures toward centralized authority, altered military practice, and deepened collective identities. Though marked by devastation, it reshaped European society, illustrating how prolonged conflict could redefine institutions and beliefs within a changing medieval world. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the social and political structures that had long defined medieval Europe began to lose their dominance. Feudalism, rooted in land-based obligation and personal loyalty, faced pressures it could no longer fully absorb. These pressures emerged gradually from demographic change, military transformation, and the growing ambitions of centralized rulers. What followed was not an abrupt disappearance, but a steady erosion of a system that had once provided stability in an uncertain world. Population decline in earlier decades had altered the balance between land and labor. With fewer people available to work the fields, peasants gained leverage that had previously been unimaginable. Labor became valuable, and mobility increased as individuals sought better conditions. Attempts by landowners to enforce traditional obligations often proved ineffective, revealing the limits of customary authority. Economic relationships shifted away from rigid dependence toward negotiation and compensation. Military change further weakened feudal arrangements. The traditional system relied on nobles who owed service in exchange for land. Over time, this model became less effective. Prolonged conflicts required professional forces capable of sustained campaigns. Monarchs increasingly turned to paid soldiers, reducing reliance on feudal levies. Standing armies, though costly, offered greater discipline and reliability. This transition diminished the military role of the feudal elite and altered the foundations of power. Central authority expanded alongside these developments. Kings sought to assert control over territories that had long operated with significant autonomy. Through taxation, legal reform, and administrative oversight, rulers strengthened their capacity to govern. Royal officials replaced local intermediaries in many areas, enforcing laws and collecting revenue directly. These measures enhanced consistency and reduced dependence on personal bonds. The rise of centralized justice played a key role in this transformation. Courts increasingly represented royal authority rather than local custom. Legal systems standardized procedures and reinforced the perception of the king as the ultimate arbiter. While unevenly applied, these institutions reshaped expectations of governance and accountability. Authority became associated with office and law rather than lineage alone. Urban influence also contributed to the decline of feudalism. Cities grew as centers of commerce and production, generating wealth independent of land ownership. Merchants and artisans gained political voice, challenging traditional hierarchies. Urban communities negotiated privileges and autonomy, creating spaces where economic power translated into influence. These developments diversified sources of authority and weakened the dominance of rural elites. Social identity evolved in response to these changes. Loyalty gradually shifted from personal lordship toward allegiance to broader political entities. The idea of belonging to a kingdom gained prominence, supported by shared laws, institutions, and symbols. This emerging sense of collective identity reinforced central rule and reduced the relevance of fragmented feudal ties. The nobility adapted in various ways. Some integrated into centralized systems, serving as officials, military commanders, or advisors. Others resisted change, seeking to preserve traditional privileges. These responses reflected the uneven pace of transformation across regions. While feudal practices persisted in many areas, their influence diminished as new forms of organization took hold. Economic relationships continued to evolve. Monetary exchange expanded, and rents increasingly replaced labor obligations. Markets and contracts shaped interactions that had once been governed by custom. This shift encouraged flexibility and efficiency, aligning social relations with changing economic realities. By the 15th century, feudalism no longer functioned as the primary organizing principle of European society. Its structures remained visible, but their authority was diluted. Centralized monarchies, professional armies, and evolving economies defined a new balance of power. This transformation reflected adaptation rather than collapse, as societies responded to long-term pressures with innovation and reform. The decline of feudalism marked a turning point in medieval history. It signaled the transition toward more centralized forms of governance and a redefinition of social relationships. Through gradual change, the medieval world moved away from personal obligation toward institutional authority, reshaping the foundations of European society as it approached a new era. By the mid-15th century, long-standing medieval structures were giving way to new patterns of thought, power, and culture. The period between 1453 and 1500 did not mark a sudden break with the past, but a gradual closing of an era shaped by transformation rather than abrupt collapse. Events during these decades symbolized profound shifts that redefined Europe's place in a changing world. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 carried immense symbolic weight. For centuries, the city had stood as a center of imperial authority, learning, and trade at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its capture by Ottoman forces signaled the end of a political legacy that traced its roots back to ancient Rome. Beyond its immediate military significance, the event altered regional power balances and redirected economic routes. European states increasingly sought alternative paths to the wealth of the East, encouraging exploration and expansion beyond familiar horizons. The loss of Constantinople also contributed to the movement of scholars and texts westward. Greek learning, preserved for generations, entered new intellectual circles, enriching academic life. This transfer of knowledge complemented existing developments within Europe, where curiosity and inquiry were already gaining momentum. The recovery and study of classical works inspired renewed attention to human potential, reason, and creativity. These intellectual currents found expression in what later generations would call the Renaissance. Though rooted in medieval traditions, this cultural movement emphasized observation, individual achievement, and engagement with the material world. Art, literature, and scholarship reflected a growing confidence in human capability. Patrons supported artists and thinkers whose works explored realism, proportion, and emotional depth. This shift did not reject faith, but rebalanced attention between spiritual concerns and worldly experience. Political structures also evolved during this period. Centralized monarchies strengthened their authority through administration, law, and taxation. Rulers relied on professional officials rather than feudal bonds, consolidating control over territories. Diplomacy and statecraft became more formalized, reflecting an emerging awareness of international relations. Power increasingly resided in institutions capable of sustaining continuity beyond individual reigns. Military practices adapted alongside these changes. New technologies altered the nature of warfare, reducing the dominance of traditional fortifications and reshaping strategies. Standing forces and improved logistics enhanced state capacity. These developments reinforced the decline of older military systems tied to personal obligation, aligning armed power with centralized authority. Economic life expanded beyond medieval constraints. Trade networks extended across seas and continents, driven by demand for goods and opportunity. Banking, credit, and commercial organization grew in sophistication, supporting ambitious ventures. Urban centers flourished as hubs of exchange and innovation, reflecting a society increasingly oriented toward growth and exploration. Social attitudes shifted as well. Education became more accessible to certain groups, fostering literacy and intellectual engagement. Individuals began to define themselves through achievement and skill rather than inherited status alone. While inequalities remained, the perception of possibility broadened, contributing to a sense of transition. By the close of the 15th century, Europe stood at the threshold of a new age. The structures of medieval life had not vanished, but their dominance had diminished. Elements of continuity coexisted with innovation, creating a layered historical moment. The end of the Middle Ages emerged not as a single event, but as a convergence of changes that reshaped identity, authority, and worldview. This period marked the conclusion of an era defined by feudal bonds, religious centrality, and localized power. In its place arose a more outward-looking society, engaged with the wider world and confident in its capacity to shape the future. The Middle Ages closed quietly, absorbed into a new chapter of history that carried forward its legacy while transforming its foundations.